Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's extended version of my top 10 movies of 2014. There is a shorter, more concise version of this video if you don't want to spend too much time on it. There's a link in the description below. However, if you would like a more in-depth review of each film on my top 10 list, then keep watching. This is the first time I'm doing one of these lists at the end of the year because I typically don't see enough movies to justify a list. But I saw a lot more than usual this year, so I thought, why not? That being said, there are still a lot of movies I haven't seen yet that were released this year that I really want to see and that I heard were good, such as Birdman, Whiplash, Boyhood, The Imitation Game, and a few others. So there are a few movies you won't see on this list simply because I haven't seen them yet. So as I do with most of my top 10s, I start with my worst. However, I won't be doing a top 10 worst movie list or even a top 5 because I was smart enough for the most part to avoid bad movies this year, especially since I don't see that many films. So many of the films that populate a lot of the 2014 worst of list, I wouldn't go anywhere near, including a barrage of bad horror films that came out this year, and movies I would typically go nowhere near, like Transformers. Also, this year was a bit abnormal because typically there's a movie or several that everybody loves, which I think is total crap, that I would include on this worst list, but unfortunately, for my desire to be controversial, there was no such movie this year. So I'll just give my worst film of the year, so just one film, which isn't quite as bad as I imagine many of those films that appeared on other worst of lists are, that I didn't see, but it was the worst of the films I did see, and that was Pompeii. I didn't expect this movie to be good. I watched it one night when I was bored, but it was even worse than I thought it would be. You can tell a movie that has bad director when you see a lot of good actors who are excellent in other things, but suck in this movie. Pompeii stars Kit Harington, who plays Jon Snow in Game of Thrones, who does an excellent job in that role on Game of Thrones. However, had I not seen him before and my only exposure to that actor was Pompeii, I would think he was a horrible actor because his performance in this movie was just awful. But I suspect that has a lot to do with the god-awful writing and amazingly cheesy dialogue. Kiefer Sutherland, excellent in 24, was also god-awful in this movie. In fact, the film featured a lot of good actors doing horrible jobs. This film was filled with every disaster movie, gladiator movie, classic movie, and any other type of movie you can think of cliche in existence, and didn't have an ounce of originality in it at all. Really, this is a horrible B-movie script that somehow got a big budget to do all these cool special effects and get a lot of great actors. Why? Who knows? Hollywood producers can be idiots sometimes, I guess. The one thing I will say that was good about this movie was the actor whose name I can't pronounce, who played Mr. Echo in Lost. I suppose his character was written slightly less cheesy than the others, and he managed to be one of the more interesting things about this film, and managed to pull off a halfway decent performance. Other than that, worst movie of the year. Okay, so now on to my best. Let me start off with some honorable mentions that didn't quite make my top 10. First is The Interview. I'll be completely upfront. Had it not been for the controversy surrounding this film, I would have never seen it. I saw the preview and it looked like another crappy Seth Rogen movie, who I'm not a big fan of. But since I did watch it, I was quite surprised that it was actually a decent flick. The character building and political satire was actually halfway decent, and it managed to keep me engaged in the story throughout, which is an achievement for a comedy flick, since plot is always secondary to laughs, and it was the funniest Seth Rogen movie I've seen. But at the end of the day, it's still an over-the-top silly comedy, so it didn't quite make my list. Another honorable mention is The Hunger Games Mockingjay Part 1. I'm not a huge fan of The Hunger Games, but I'm very interested in media portrayal of and propaganda, and that was a big issue that this film addressed, albeit in a clunky, on-the-nose type manner, typical of the Hunger Games. I still appreciated the commentary on how image and how the issue is perceived is just as important as the issue itself. And on top of that, the film managed to be thrilling and keep me engaged as well. But its biggest flaw, and the reason it didn't make my top 10, was that it was not at all a standalone film, and it was simply a setup for the next movie. I went in knowing to expect this, so I wasn't disappointed, but I can't put a movie with no real beginning, middle, or end on my list. And the last honorable mention I'll throw out there is Guardians of the Galaxy. When I first saw the trailer for this film, I thought it looked horrible, and I was thinking there was no way I'm seeing this. But after hearing all the praise it received after it was released, I decided to give it a shot. And it did, it was much better than when I expected it to be. The movie managed to keep a fun, upbeat feel to it through the interactions between its main protagonist, and managed to be quite funny at times. It was a great example of teamwork movie, and in some ways more so than the Avengers. And the character Groot was worth seeing. He was worth seeing the movie for alone. However, I don't quite feel it's worthy of all the praise it's been receiving, as the cheesy comic booky elements was a bit over the top, and the constant explosions get a bit old after a while, and the film does use a lot of action movie cliches. Some people are comparing this movie to Star Wars, which I personally feel is a comparison that's way out of line. To me, this doesn't even begin to approach the epicness of Star Wars, and I would say a more apt comparison would be Men in Black, which is another fun sci-fi comedy I enjoyed, but not one of the greatest movies of all time. So on to my top 10, starting with my number 10, Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. This film sets a really dark tone from the outset and manages to be a very good follow-up to The Rise of the Planet of the Apes, which surprised the hell out of me that it didn't actually suck. The film should be commended as well that it gets audiences to sympathize with a group of CGI apes, as during the film you kind of forget you're not watching people. Also, this film should be commended for avoiding Hollywood cliches and being unpredictable. It's been said by many that this film is excellent as there are no real villains. Everyone in there is like three-dimensional and no one is portrayed outright evil. And I think that's true for the most part. However, I do feel there are a few exceptions, such as Carver, played by Kurt Ace Vidal, who appeared on Oz and Fringe, whose character was a bit stereotypical, hothead, looking to start trouble. I would even say that the main antagonist of the film, the ape Koba, was a tad bit of a cliched villain, even though he was well-rounded and explained why he felt the way he did. I still feel some of the things he did were stereotypical of movie villains and was just there to push the plot forward rather than portray a fully developed character. However, I did think this was a great movie with a well-developed script that never goes in the direction you expect it to. Number 9 is The Edge of Tomorrow, which I'm not going to call this movie anything else because that's its title, The Edge of Tomorrow. I find it a bit unfortunate that any movie about a time loop automatically gets compared to Groundhog's Day. Groundhog's Day isn't the only material in the visual medium to cover time loops. It's simply the most popular. So any movie that also does time loops is not ripping off or trying to be like Groundhog's Day, okay? So just stop saying that. In fact, a few years before Groundhog's Day came out, there was an episode of Star Trek The Next Generation called Cause and Effect about a time loop. So when Groundhog's Day came out, I was like, oh, this is a rip-off of Cause and Effect. Groundhog's Day does not have a monopoly on time loops. Sorry, that's just a pet peeve of mine. So bearing in mind this movie is nothing like Groundhog's Day, except that it features a time loop, Edge of Tomorrow is a fun time travel action adventure movie that surprised a lot of people. This film isn't a work of genius or something that gets you thinking, but it's a fun action film that uses the rarely used method of time loops and good, well-rounded characters to tell an engaging action movie. And that's all it tries to be, a fun action movie. And in that aspect, it performs very well at its job. Watching this film is a good, fun way to spend the evening. Number 8 will be a tad bit controversial, as it's a movie many didn't like or were disappointed with. I came into this movie expecting not to like it, but it totally surprised me, and that was Godzilla. My first reaction to hearing that they were making yet another Godzilla remake was, oh my god, not again, just give it a rest already. But I heard some good things about this movie, so one evening when I was bored, I thought, what the hey, and just rented the DVD. I can't help but compare this movie to the previous year's Pacific Rim, which I did not like at all. I knew tons of people who did like it, but what they said was, it's a movie about giant monsters fighting robots and it doesn't try to be anything else. But the thing is, that concept doesn't appeal to me at all. So naturally, I hated that movie. And in fact, at the big final showdown at the end of the film, which is typically supposed to be the most exciting, nail-biting part of the movie, I was so bored I literally fell asleep. Because Pacific Rim's character and writing was so bland and two-dimensional, the film never gave me one reason to give two shits about what happened to these cheesy cardboard cutouts. So when I rented Godzilla, I got my pillows and blankets ready in case I needed to take a snooze. But to my great surprise, I was completely engaged the whole way through. Bear in mind that I typically don't like monster movies, but I loved Godzilla. It seemed to me that the people who do typically like monster movies are the ones who didn't like this film. The biggest complaint I hear about this film is that Godzilla barely appears in the film. But you know what? Not only am I okay with this, I felt this probably is one of the main reasons why I liked this film so much, because the fact that you didn't see Godzilla that much made the times when you did see him so much better. Everyone, even the people who didn't care for this film, goes on about how awesome the fighting scenes with Godzilla at the end were. But I say, one of the main reasons they were so awesome was because you didn't see that much of him. So when you did see him, everything was still fresh and more interesting. Unlike Pacific Rim, which was just an overdose of giant monsters throughout its film, where you just got so jaded to them and no longer were interesting. Another great complaint I hear was that Bryan Cranston was severely underused in this film, but this was something I was aware of when I first saw it, so I prepared myself for it. And I would even say if Cranston was underused, the scenes with him at the start of the film were so phenomenal that it helped set the tone for the rest of the film and get the viewer invested right away. So that when he wasn't there, you were still deeply invested in all these other characters who are maybe not quite as interesting. Also, I appreciate this as being director Gareth Edwards' second film, a follow-up to the independent film he did called Monsters, which was basically a typical indie romance film, but with giant monsters in the background. I wasn't very impressed with that film, but I found Godzilla to be a much better, well-developed follow-up to that film, where he got to expand upon that idea with a bigger budget and an iconic character, as in both films he focused more on the human characters than the monsters, but used the looming threat of the monsters to expand upon that story, and I thought he did it very well. I was impressed. Number 7 is Captain America: Winter Soldier. This is the movie I've been hearing about all year. Everyone and their mother, well, at least my mother, was telling me about how great this movie was. But I had my doubts because, first of all, I'm not a big fan of comic book movies. And I saw the first Captain America movie and it sucked. I mean, it really sucked. I think this might be another movie I fell asleep in. Well, although I didn't doubt that this would be better than the first because of all the praise it was getting, I did doubt that it would live up to all the hype. But to my surprise, it did. This ended up being one of the most suspenseful and engaging action spy type films I've seen in a long, long time. Comic book movie or no. I can say this is easily my favorite film done by Marvel Studios thus far. There were a lot of things about this film that were really over the top, silly, comic booky, but not so much where it interfered with the story they were telling or took me out of the moment. I think watching all these other comic book movies helped me to build a tolerance to that, and this film isn't quite as bad as the others, so it really helped me to look past that. One of the first action sequences in the film, where Nick Fury was attacked in his car, was one of the most amazing action sequences I've seen in a long time and immediately hooked me. And the other action sequences that followed didn't disappoint and managed to keep me engaged throughout. A well-done action spy movie that also happens to be a comic book movie that succeeds well at doing that. However, this isn't the only comic book movie I like this year, as there is another one that is higher on this list. That, in fact, comes in at number 6, and that is X-Men Days of Future Past. Now, I will admit my bias here, as I've always been partial to the X-Men movies, since X-Men was my favorite comic book growing up, and the only one I really read on a regular basis. So, when I'm willing to give X-Men a little bit more leeway. That being said, when an X-Men movie sucks, like X-Men 3 or X-Men Origins Wolverine, I'm certainly willing to recognize that. But when an X-Men movie is good, and this one certainly was, I'm willing to overlook some of the flaws. And I will say, this is by far my favorite X-Men movie since X2. I liked the first class cast, but I always favored the original cast, so it was amazing to see them both in one film together, even if the focus was a bit more on the first class cast. But I felt the way they incorporated both casts was amazing. I've always been a fan of time travel stories, like where the good guys have to travel into the past to stop some depressing post-apocalyptic future from happening, and I thought this one was pulled off really well. As I said, it did have some flaws, like the stuff with Magneto at the end with RFK Stadium was really over the top, and the ending wasn't as satisfying as it could have been, but some of the scenes along the way were simply amazing, such as the scene where future Charles Xavier was talking to past Charles Xavier. I got goosebumps during that scene. I remember thinking to myself, man, I can't believe how awesome this scene is. And the time crunch of the future people's ultimate demise bearing near was a constant undertone for the film that really drove the tension up the stakes. So there was so much about this movie to like. In particular, what really made me like this movie was the fact that it erased X-Men 3 from history. You know, they used the time travel thing to say, oh no, the first X-Men still happened, but that one, gone. Great, that was absolutely awesome. Anyway, my number 5 is Gone Girl. I consider myself a David Fincher fan, but I don't like all of his movies. There were a few I thought were misses, like Benjamin Button, Panic Room, and Zodiac. But this movie I see as one of the greatest and a return to form. It has that awesome and unique style of storytelling that works really well, and he really knows how to drive tension. The twist in this film, of course, was amazing, and more importantly, it really worked for the story and helped shape the world of the characters, even though it changed your whole perspective of the film. As I mentioned before, I'm a huge fan of films that deal with the media and how perspective is everything, but frankly, I was a tad disappointed this film didn't deal more with that, as I was expecting it to be the main focus of the film, kind of more like a serious drama, but it turned out to be kind of over-the-top thriller that was more about the twist. That being said, it was still a great film for that genre, and it did touch on aspects of the media and how easily people's perception can be twisted and how image is everything. I felt the ending dealt with this really nicely. And the performance by Affleck and Rosamund Pike was simply amazing. However, there is one aspect of the storytelling I think should have been done differently, and it would have been a much better movie. I can't go into too much detail without giving away spoilers, but I will say that this film would have benefited from some non-linear storytelling, such as what Tarantino did with Pulp Fiction and Reservoir Dogs, and what Nolan did with Memento and The Prestige, particularly involving the reveal of the mid-film twist, which I think would have been better had it been told in a less linear fashion. However, still a great movie worth seeing. Number 4 is a movie that technically came out in 2013 because that's when it was released in film festivals and whatnot, but it was not made available to the general public or to me, more importantly, until 2014. So I'm counting it as a 2014 movie, and that is Enemy. Now, my relationship with Enemy is a bit strange because I was watching this film, I wasn't too sure about it. I was thinking this was kind of stupid, kind of didn't make any sense. And by the end of it, I was like, what the fuck was that? I mean, my first reaction was to hate it, then to like it, but ultimately I was confused. The ending was just mind-blowing. I mean, the film didn't seem all that weird throughout. It seemed kind of weird, but the end was like super mega weird. But when I went online and did some research and found out what the film was really about, so the tagline of what it appears to be about is a man who meets his exact double, and the encounter turns a bit creepy. But when I went online and I read what it was really about, and although parts of the movie could be seen as subjective or open to interpretation, the main theme of what the movie is really about, what all the weird scenes really mean, isn't. It has a very specific meaning set out by the writer, and this film is based off a novel, so both the author of the novel and the director stated outright in the interviews what it's really about. But I won't state that here because I think it's better to experience the movie first without knowing. So anyway, after I found out what it was really about, and I watched this film again, I had a whole new perspective on it. Everything was so clear to me in the scenes that at first I thought were lame because no one would really act like that when put in this situation. It seemed like a cheesy film cliche just thrown in to look creepy, but once I knew what the film was actually about, I could see it actually made perfect sense, and it fit perfectly with the character story, and it was amazing. I had kind of a similar experience with Lost Highway when I first saw it. I didn't like it because it made no sense, but once it made sense to me, it became one of my all-time favorite movies. I don't think Enemy will become one of my all-time favorite movies, but it is a damn good film, an excellent artistic achievement, and it really inspired me to try to be a bit more abstract with my own work. Number 3 is Nightcrawler, another Jake Gyllenhaal film, and he gave a great performance in both films, but his performance in this film was completely amazing. If he doesn't win the Oscar for Best Actor for this film, it will be the greatest robbery in Oscar history. But as I mentioned several times now, I like films about media, and that is primarily why I love this film so much. It paints such a dark picture of the media, I love it. It reveals in some very subtle ways how the media shapes people's perceptions of reality, in this case of urban crime, how what people actually think of urban crime is a bit different than what it actually is, and that has a lot to do with what they see on the 11 o'clock news. But mainly this film is a character study about a sociopath, and the main character's development in this film only goes from bad to worse, as it's about a common thief who gets a new career filming accidents and crimes and then selling that footage to local news. And this character only gets more twisted as the film goes. And again, I cannot understate what an amazing job Gyllenhaal does portraying this twisted character who's such a fully and richly developed character. You can completely understand if not empathize with him. But it's so fun in a dark and morbidly twisted way to watch the levels to which this guy will sink. The whole film is what I would describe as groundbreaking. And so that leads me to my number 2, which I'm going to be a bit unconventional with. I rented this DVD from the store the other day, and I went home to look it up on Rotten Tomatoes to see what kind of score I got, but it said it hasn't been released yet. And I was thinking to myself, what the hell are you talking about? I'm holding the DVD in my hand. How can you say it hasn't been released? But then I discovered it was because it was an Australian film, which surprised me since it stars Ethan Hawke, is set in Cleveland, Ohio, and New York City, and everyone in the film has American accents. But apparently, even though it's set in America, it is strictly an Australian-made film. And because I live in New Zealand, it was released here a lot sooner than it was in the US, which won't be released there until January of 2015. So Rotten Tomatoes counts it as a 2015 movie, but I'm going to count it as a 2014 movie, since that's when it was released to the public in its native country, and that's when it was made available to me. And that film that is my number 2 film is Predestination. So when I saw this film at the DVD store, it was listed as a time travel thriller starring Ethan Hawke about a temporal agent who travels back to the past to prevent crimes from happening. And to be honest, this didn't sound too promising to me. The plot sounded like some cliched version of Minority Report or Time Cop. And the fact that it was a science fiction starring Ethan Hawke made me think of The Purge, which can be described as a below average film at best. And the fact that I'd never heard of it before made me suspect it was some crappy B-movie. I almost didn't rent it, but I'm a sucker for science fiction, so I got it anyway. And man, was I in for a shock. The premise about the time cop that was described on the box isn't actually what it's about. The reason why it doesn't tell you what the film is really about, because they can't tell you what it's really about without giving away some really hefty, groundbreaking spoilers. The plot about the temporal agent is actually only a piece of the overall makeup of the film and not its main focus. A better way, I think, to describe what this film is about without giving away spoilers is that it's about a time paradox, and it's a character study. It's a character study of someone who's involved in a time paradox. So, as soon as I finished watching this film, the first thing I thought to myself was, man, I need to watch this movie again. So I watched it a second time, and almost had a better experience watching it the second time. And after I watched it the second time, I thought, man, I need to watch this for a third time. But I had stuff to do, no time for watching the same movie 3 times in a row, so I just scanned through and watched certain scenes for a third time. And that's when I knew this was something special. To me, best films are the ones that make you want to watch it more than once, that get better with the second viewing. So from that alone, I knew that this was a really good movie that I liked. It gives you something to ponder over. It leaves you intrigued long after you finish watching it. In fact, I think I'll have to buy this film because I'm going to want to see this movie many more times. It's an amazing time travel story, one of the best and most original time travel films ever made. It's based off of a short story by Robert Heinlein, one of the most well-known classic science fiction novelists who wrote such classics as Stranger in a Strange Land and Starship Troopers. Truth be told, I'm personally not a huge fan of his works, but I could definitely see the aspects of his works that I liked mixed in with some modern storytelling that has me thinking I probably would prefer the film to the short story. As such, its time travel logic is pretty impeccable and consistent, which is a welcome change after movies such as Looper, which I did like, but it completely butchered time travel logic. The film also features a good performance by Ethan Hawke, but a completely amazing performance by Australian actress Sarah Snook. who is the real star of this film. Hulk, of course, had to get top billing because he's a major Hollywood movie star, but I felt Sarah Snook's performance was definitely the focus of the film and what stood out the most, not just for me, but every review I watched before screening the movie raved about how amazing her performance was. I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to say this because I knew this before I watched the film and it didn't spoil anything for me, but in the film, Sarah Snook plays both a woman and a man, and she does such an amazing job in both roles. You really buy her as a man. She doesn't come off as a woman pretending to be a man, but a man. And the great job the makeup people did making her look like a man really helped in this regard. I mean, this makeup was far superior in what you see in Cloud Atlas, which was also tried to gender swap, but it didn't turn out very well. But here it was pulled off much better. But as I said, I think Sarah Snook's performance helps a lot in that regard. Some people say that she should get nominated for an Oscar, but I know she won't since it's just an Australian film. But she should become big after this and start landing some major roles because people are going to be blown away by her performance here. I heard one reviewer refer to this movie as a B film, and that really annoyed me. Just because it's a low budget thriller doesn't make it a B movie. B movies indicate that it's subpar. This film has amazing acting, amazing writing, an intense, complicated story which has you thinking about it for days, along with well-developed character story. I'm not sure what more you could ask for. I almost put this film as my number one, but it didn't quite make it. So on to my choice for number one, which is a controversial choice considering the polarizing effect this film had on audiences. But because so many hated this film won't make me change my mind and say I like it less just because some other people didn't like it. I honestly feel this is the best movie of the year, and my number one pick for 2014 is Interstellar. So everybody seems to be talking about this movie after it came out, either saying negative things, positive things, or both. Whether people liked it or not, it seemed to impact them and make them want to talk about it. So I tried to see this movie as soon as possible to avoid the spoilers everyone was talking about, plus I wanted to see what all the hubbub was about. So even though Christopher Nolan is one of my favorite directors, there have been movies of his I didn't like, so I wasn't convinced I would like it, and because of the nature of the mixed reviews, I wasn't convinced that I would hate it either. So I went in with a completely open mind, also bearing in mind I knew very little about this film before I saw it, and it completely blew me away. Seldom do I get so engaged in a movie that I completely forget my actual surroundings. I heard some people say they needed to pee, but were too engrossed in this film to get up. Well, I needed to pee, but I was too engrossed in this film to even notice. It was like a slight nagging feeling in the back of my mind. It wasn't until the credits rolled that I realized that I needed to pee. Personally, I love science fiction and Christopher Nolan's style, so I think these two probably contributed greatly to how much I love this film. To me, a great film is a film that shows me something I've never seen before. It makes me think, that this is something unique and special. Very few films do that. This one did, which is kind of ironic considering a review I read of this film that called it a hatchbag of a whole bunch of other films rolled into one. And boy, I couldn't possibly disagree more with that. I pretty much feel the exact opposite is the case. I know this film was inspired by 2001: A Space Odyssey, and that's fine. Many great films are similar to and take inspiration from other films. That doesn't at all make it a ripoff or, say it's copying from it. I actually preferred this film to 2001, which may sound like a controversial statement until you learn that I didn't like 2001. So considering there are literally hundreds of films I think are better than 2001, that statement's not so controversial. However, one thing that I specifically thought was handled better in 2001 was something I always had a problem with 2001, which contributed to why I didn't like it. And that is that the robot, or artificial intelligence, is the bad guy. He turns out to be homicidal and tries to kill the astronauts. Although this may have not been cliched at the time that this film was released, to me it's indicative of mankind's tendency to fear the unknown. And, and because it's artificial intelligence. And I personally find that a bit weak, which is one of the reasons why I instantly was turned off by any killer robot story. That was corrected in the sequel 2010, the year we made contact, by saying the only reason the robot went killer was because the military fucked with his programming that caused him to malfunction, which is one of the many reasons why I like the sequel better. Anyway, in Interstellar, the robots are fine. Not only do they not go psycho, but they end up being good, reliable sidekicks to the astronauts. But more than that, the villain in the film turns out to come from within and be more about humanity's inner struggle, which to me is a far more interesting concept than killer robots. And I thought the way this was explored in this film was spectacular. I've literally never seen a space drama that tries to stick closely to what we know about science, as opposed to an out-and-out space fantasy like Star Wars that was like this film. In my mind, this film has reached a level of greatness for a space opera that was previously not achieved. Once the film was over, I was so affected by it I couldn't even move. I could barely breathe. It took me a while before I could actually get out of my seat and leave the theater. And this is a very rare occurrence. That being said, I don't think this film is perfect. If I had to rate it amongst my all-time favorites, it would probably come somewhere in the 20s or 30s, below some of Nolan's other films, such as The Prestige, Inception, and Memento, which I all liked better. Because this film does have flaws, particularly with the ending. I agree with some of the more reasonable reviews that point out that the ending wasn't handled the best. But to be clear, I completely disagree with the reviews that completely hated the ending or claimed it ruined the film. I thought the surprise ending, or the climax of the film, was an outstanding idea. I just don't think it was executed as well as it could have been. Specifically, I felt it was far too literal, and it hit audiences over the head with what was really happening, when I feel it would have been far better had this been left more ambiguous and made the audiences try to figure it out rather than hitting them over the head with a sledgehammer. A lot of reviewers are blaming Nolan for this, but personally I sense the intervention of the studios, although that's just a guess. I could imagine them not wanting a huge budget blockbuster film to have an ending that doesn't really make sense, and thus forcing Nolan to make it painfully obvious what was going on. Because I experienced this on a smaller scale with my modest works, whereas this film had an ending more like Enemy, it would have been far better. And also the very end of the scene, right before the credits roll, the final resolution, I feel wasn't explained well enough. I was a bit confused. So I'll have to watch it again and see if I missed something. So as I hinted at earlier in the film, this film has been dividing audiences like no other I can remember. It seems all you have to do is mention Interstellar on the internet and instantly a fight starts. If you go to the extremes of both parties, you have people who love it saying anyone who didn't like it is too stupid to understand it, and people who hated it calling anyone who loved it a Nolan fanboy, who would love any movie he does regardless of the quality. So of course I'm talking about both extremes here. So both of the extremes were probably made up of immature teenagers, because the truth is, people just have different opinions. If you hated the film, doesn't mean you're an idiot. If you loved it, it doesn't mean you're a fanboy. It just means this film spoke to you or it didn't. I will have to admit that since there is a large camp who really didn't like this film, or who thought it was good up until the end that ruined it, then the film doesn't do a good job of appealing to a wider audience. And I would say this is more of a niche film that is only going to appeal to certain types of audience, not a wider general audience. And that's fine. The only reason it's an issue is because in this case it just happens to be released as a huge blockbuster movie. If it was released as more of an indie film, this wouldn't be such of an issue. But anyway, regardless of what anyone else thinks about it, I felt Interstellar was the best movie of 2014. It was certainly the most memorable and emotionally powerful film-going experience I had in years. So that's it for my top 10 movies of 2014. I'm also doing a series on my top 50 favorite movies of my lifetime, so you should subscribe to check that out as well, and thanks a lot for watching.